Not one of them called me in 3 months. Not on my birthday, not on Thanksgiving. I would stand at the kitchen sink and listen for the phone like it used to be part of the house's rhythm. But the house was only a house now, an echo chamber of pictures and plates, the old clock ticking louder than conversation. My name is Barbara. I'm 70. I raised 3 children in this house with my husband Richard. 43 years of marriage, summers on the porch, Christmas stockings, scraped knees, college applications, and countless casseroles for whoever needed one. We paid off this place when the kids were small. By the time Richard died, the house was ours in that way that feels permanent. 4 bedrooms, oak floors, the maple tree out front that turns gold every October, and a bank of memories stacked in the mantel photographs. We had some security, a paid-off mortgage, a modest pension Richard had built over a life of steady work, life insurance that helped when he passed, and savings that were meant to tide me into a comfortable old age. I never expected to become a ledger of everyone else's needs instead. Daniel is the oldest, 45. Jennifer is 42. Michael is 39. All good kids in their ways. People assume, because I did, that love comes with a built-in kindness. But affection and entitlement are not the same things. Over the years, requests started small. A loan to get through a rough patch, money for a down payment, a few checks to bridge a late rent. Each one I answered because that's what mothers do. We step in, we worry, we sacrifice. It crept up like ivy, quiet and green. One favor became 2, then a pattern we both accepted without naming. For 4 years I kept a list, not because I suspected malice, but because I wanted to be fair to myself. I found the list tucked into my cardigan one night after a restlessness woke me at 2 a.m., a stack of numbers I had written in blue ink. When I added them up, my own hand surprised me. Nearly $300,000. $300,000 over 4 years. Checks written, direct transfers, co-signed loans, the odd cash envelope slipped into envelopes labeled for utilities, for the van, for the business that would surely take off. I had always imagined helping was temporary. I never realized how fast temporary could become a job without pay. Thomas, my financial advisor, is a patient man with a penchant for numbers and the sort of bluntness you can only afford when you're not emotionally invested. When he laid out the projections, I watched the color leave my face. "You won't run out next month," he said, tapping a spreadsheet. "Not even next year. But if this strain keeps up, the math says you could be depleted in 6 years. That assumes no emergency, which is not how life usually works." I had to hear it twice. 6 years. I'd never pictured living with the worry that my house, my home, might one day be the only thing they saw as mine. In the weeks after that meeting, I kept looking at the photographs over the mantel. There's one from 1996, Richard with tomato sauce on his cheek, our youngest's hair sticking up like a rooster's comb, and all 3 kids laughing as if someone had just told the best joke that would hold between us forever. That photograph felt like a time machine I was learning to distrust. The requests didn't come from strangers. They came from the people whose pictures lined my hall. They came with the gentle language of need. "Mom, can you help with the deposit? Do you have a few hundred? We're short this month." I learned to fold shame into a small box and hand it over because the alternative, saying no, felt cruel. Saying no felt like turning my back on my children when they needed a parent. So I endured the unease. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I was lucky to be able to help, but the numbers kept creeping and the asking never stopped. There was a family meeting the spring before the first silence. I had had enough of the unease. I had caught myself writing checks at 2 a.m. and resenting the quiet voice in my head that asked what I was building by giving everything away. I invited them over for dinner that Tuesday because it was easier to say something when food was on the table and the light was soft. I went into that living room with index cards in my pocket, small scraps of paper where I'd written the totals, $300,000. The cards felt like a confession I had rehearsed under my pillow. When I started to speak, my voice steadied because the numbers were real. I told them, plainly, that I couldn't continue like this. I told them the truth Thomas had shown me. I asked them to understand that their mother was not a bank. At first, there was silence. Then Daniel's jaw tightened. Jennifer's eyes dropped. Michael put his hands on his knees like he was ready to leave the room. "You're our mother," Daniel said finally. "You don't understand. There are real problems here. We're trying." "I know you're trying," I answered, "but you have to try for yourselves. I can't make your choices forever." They left angry. Not everyone storms out. Sometimes anger is a cold kind of leaving. They left with a wounded look, and a couple of days later the calls slowed to a stop. For weeks the house was quiet in a way that swallowed sound. I thought that would be the end of it, like any storm that passes. I was wrong. Holidays became exercises in endurance. On Thanksgiving I set the table just in case. I lit candles and made mashed potatoes the way Richard used to like, with plenty of butter. I called them. No one came. The phone stayed silent. I learned new rituals, watching the same cooking show I had watched when the kids were small, and pretending that the laughter from the television was a stand-in for family conversation. I would tell myself happy things to keep the air from getting too thin. The house is yours. You can do whatever you want with it. But some nights, honest nights, I sat in the dark and felt the absence as if it were a physical weight on my chest. There were other kinds of hurt that don't get announced in a headline. Emotional distancing is an eraser. Someone slowly takes a pencil and rubs out the parts of you they don't find convenient. When the money stopped, so did the calls. Invitations to casual get-togethers evaporated. Pictures stopped being tagged. I was present in their lives only as far as my wallet was willing to be. I tried different things. I saw a doctor. He called it understandable grief and prescribed something to help with sleep. I took long walks with Margaret, my neighbor who moved to Asheville a few years ago and sends me postcards of the mountains with notes like, "You should come, Barbara." Margaret's postcards felt like invitations to a life that wasn't sewn shut with obligation. Days piled into months. The silence grew habitual. Then one bright, ordinary afternoon at the supermarket, a single line from a stranger, someone whom I already knew, tore the blindfold off. I was in the canned goods aisle, reaching for a tin of soup, when I heard Jennifer's laughter a few carts down. She was on the phone, and I could hear a piece of the conversation even before my ears registered the words. It was Patricia, Daniel's wife, talking, and she was laughing. That laugh had a clarity to it, the kind you have when you finally say something out loud that had been simmering for a while. I didn't mean to eavesdrop. I tried to pull my card away and go on about going to shove up my... But a phrase floated over my head and landed like a small stone in the middle of the aisle. "We can just wait her out," Patricia said, as if she were describing a plan to get the perfect parking spot. "She'll be gone before long. That house will be ours." I remember the way the fluorescent light above the aisle made the soup cans look like a choir of silver bells. For a few seconds, the world narrowed down to the 3 words, "Wait her out," and then my breath seemed too loud. The hurt wasn't theatrical, it was clinical. It cut through the fog of excuses I had kept telling myself, about being needed, about family obligations. The laugh that followed felt like a confirmation I had been afraid to name. They were counting on my death as an event, not praying for my health. They were treating my life as a timetable to be managed. After I left the store, I sat in the car for a long time with my steering wheel warm under my hands. I laughed, but it wasn't a real laugh. It was the stunned sound of someone who had been nudged awake. That moment crystallized a truth I had been avoiding. They cared more about what I would leave behind than about me while I was still here. When I told Thomas, he didn't gasp or comfort me into softness.
He listened, and then he asked the question that has a way of putting practical hands on emotional wounds. What do you want to have happen to this house? It was the simplest question, but I hadn't been allowed to ask it for myself. For so long, the assumed default had been, one day it will pass to them. In the years after Richard died, it had been as if the house awaited a future inheritance, like a hidden pot of gold. But inheritance is a future tense, and I am living now. What I want, I told Thomas, is to not be reduced to an object while I'm still breathing. I want to be seen as a person. Saying it out loud made it sound less theatrical and more like a plan that required steps. I began to think of the title people would give a story like mine. They would say, "They cut her out of the inheritance," as if that captured the whole of it. It did, in a sense, but it left out the part where I decided not to be a passive character in my own life. So I said it. They think they'll inherit this place when I'm gone. My voice felt small, but it landed on the table like a stone. Thomas, who had been around other people's messy lives for a long time, nodded. "You can execute your wishes now," he said carefully. "You don't have to wait for a will to do what you want for your life." When he used the word execute, I felt it jolt. Execute a will. The phrase usually belongs in courtrooms or in the quiet of a lawyer's office, as people sign documents meant to take effect after a lifetime. I saw it differently in that moment. They expected to inherit the house when I died.
Instead, I began to realize I could execute my will while I was alive. I could decide the fate of this house, and by doing so, reclaim my narrative, rather than waiting for a future they had already mapped out. That idea felt radical. It felt sane. I was not ready to be a footnote in someone else's story. I wanted to live the remaining chapters on my terms. Planning this wasn't dramatic. There were no midnight conspiracies, no forged documents. There were phone calls and questions and people whose jobs are to move real estate and money without drama. I spoke to Susan, the realtor Thomas recommended. She's in her 50s, has an eye for staging, and moved through the rooms with a professional hunger that felt like competence I could lean on. She walked through the house as if cataloging its life, making notes about light and curb appeal. Listing at $875, Susan said after a long afternoon of measuring windows and smoothing throw pillows. You'll probably get more interest than you expect. The market's been kind to houses like yours. $875,000? I had to remember to breathe. The number was an anchor that tied the emotional to the practical, a way to turn a house of memories into a resource that could buy me a different kind of life.
Thomas drew up scenarios. If it listed at $875,000 and received offers in the low 900s, after realtor fees, taxes, and closing costs, it would net roughly $862,000. He laid it out plainly. He numbered the columns and shaded the worst-case possibilities so there would be no surprises. Even as I made plans, I was careful. Not for secrecy's sake. This was not about trickery, but because announcing a plan in the middle of a family that had already shown its disappointment would be like holding a match to dry kindling. I didn't want drama. I wanted safety and dignity. I found myself taking smaller steps that felt like armor for my vulnerability, telling only Margaret at first, signing a retainer with attorney Patricia. Yes, another Patricia, but this one is a lawyer, a calm woman who answered in clipped sentences that meant business, and asking Susan to market discreetly without an open house that would make the sale the water cooler topic I feared. There were practical things I had to do that made the decision feel real. Sorting a lifetime into boxes, deciding which furniture to keep, which things to donate. On a Tuesday, I opened the spare bedroom closet and found that Richard had hung a suit he never wore. It smelled faintly of cedar. I turned the hanger in my hands and felt a small pain and a small relief at the same time. I boxed up the kids' school drawings, the trophies with their dust, the small ceramic angels my mother had given me. One thing I packed with the tenderness of ritual was the family photo album from 1996. It was heavy with laughter. It sat on top of my boxes like a small, stubborn heart. I wrote a note, too. Writing it felt both necessary and terrifying. I sat at the kitchen table with the late afternoon sun cutting clean lines across the oak wood and wrote simply. I told them why, in language that tried to balance truth with gentleness. I explained how the numbers had frightened me, how I had felt invisible in my last years, how I had tried everything I could before making this choice. I told them I loved them. I asked them to understand that choosing to sell was not a punishment, it was a boundary. I did not mail it. That was part of the plan. The note would be left in the kitchen drawer and mailed so it would arrive after closing. I wanted the house's sale to be a fait accompli before the hurt got louder. People imagine decisive acts as loud. They picture a curtain being ripped back and a microphone being dropped. My decisions felt quieter, like closing a book that had been left open too long. The realtor took professional photos, palace shots of the living room with a vase of lilies, a wide image of the maple tree framed as if in a travel magazine. The listing went live with a discreet agent's ID and no ostentation. We avoided the open house for reasons that were not dramatic, simply because I didn't want strangers tramping through the rooms where my children had learned to ride bikes.
The day the first offer came, I was on the porch talking to Margaret, who had come by with 2 cups of strong coffee and a towel of sympathy tucked over her arm. Susan called in a low voice that had a smile built into it. "We have one," she said. "They're asking for a quick close." Quick was the operative word. I remember standing with my hand on the banister and thinking of all the images that belonged to this house, the way Richard would leave the back door open in summer, the episode when Michael painted the dog with finger paint, the nights my mother visited and we stayed up knitting and telling stories. Those images had weight, but what I felt then was not greed. It was the pragmatic move of a woman who had been taught to take care of things, now taking care of herself. Thomas ran the numbers again, double-checked, signed the forms with the care of someone putting a roof on a house. Attorney Patricia drafted a letter that would make the house's sale clear and lawful. Susan negotiated, as realtors do, until the offer landed at $910,000. I remember the digits because they were the difference between imagining a different life and staying stuck. $9.10 for an asking of $8.75, netting roughly $8.62 after fees and taxes. I sat with those numbers like a woman counting small blessings. I didn't tell them. Not yet. Not until the ink dried and the checks were accounted for. I wanted to protect myself from the storm of opinions and the chorus of guilt that seemed to accompany every act of independence I took. So I packed a single photograph in a shoebox and carried it to the car as if I were sneaking out with contraband. The photograph, 1996, was placed in a small, soft bag that would travel with me. Packing was a slow, sacred work. I wrapped dishes I had washed 1,000 times. I wrapped them like I was putting away old friends. I left a pot on the stove and a note tucked into the drawer where the kids had once kept their trading cards. The note was not confrontational. It was explanatory, in that way a letter from someone who has been thinking long and quietly becomes. I explained my reasons and told them the plan would be, in short, to move south to Asheville, where Margaret had a condo with a balcony that looked at a postcard. There would be a little garden, there would be community, there would be watercolor classes, there would be a life that was not measured in bank balances owed. Even then, as I taped the last box shut, there was a tremor of fear. I wondered what would happen when they discovered the listing. I wondered if I had been selfish or brave, or both. Questions buzzed like flies at the window. But there was something else, too. A feeling I had not had in a long time. The quiet of someone making a choice that aligns with their own heart. I suppose the part that surprises people is that I didn't do what so many expect. I didn't hide money or scheme. I moved according to the law.
I executed my will while I was alive by deciding how my home would serve me in my remaining years. That phrasing always raises eyebrows, executed the will, because people think of wills as documents waiting in drawers for lawyers and probate courts. For me, it meant something simpler and truer. I acted to ensure my life would not be predicated on the day I died. I chose to be present for my own later years. I chose not to let my late life be a mere runway to a future inheritance. Margaret drove me to the bank the day we finalized the arrangements, and we had coffee afterwards at a little cafe that smelled of cinnamon. We didn't obsess over revenge. We planned roses for the new balcony. Margaret told me about a watercolor teacher who liked to paint the way light hit sand. The order of priorities had shifted. Where once my days were weighted by others' needs, they were now being arranged by small pleasures. Tea at 4, the book club that met on Thursdays, volunteering for a women's shelter where my hands could be useful without draining me. When I signed the listing agreement, my signature looked steadier than I felt. I remember thinking of the people who would read the headline. They cut her out of the inheritance. She executed the will. A journalist might write that, and it would be both true and incomplete. Yes, I had been cut out of the warm attention that used to come with being a mother who provided. Yes, they had treated the house like a future prize. And yes, I had executed my will in the sense that I made a legal, conscious choice about the future of my home before any of that inheritance drama could determine my present. There was still fear. There was still the ache of absence. But alongside that was a new muscle being flexed, dignity, not in the sense of pride that needs to be shown off, but in the quieter, sturdier sense of someone who has decided what they will and will not tolerate. I learned how to say no and mean it. I learned how to rely on professionals, Thomas, Susan, attorney Patricia, who could make sure my choices were legal and clear. And I started to imagine a life that belonged to me first, not as a precursor to someone else's gain. If you're watching this and you have a story like mine, if you've ever been the person who kept giving until it felt like you were giving away the rest of your life, drop your location in the comments. I want to know I'm not alone. There's a small comfort in knowing faces and places share these quiet hurts. By the end of the week, the listing was live. The house looked beautiful in the photographs. Neutral tones, soft light, the maple tree standing like a reliable friend. People began to call. My phone lit up with messages from brokers, inquiries that were polite and practical. My children had not yet been told. That was deliberate. I had learned how quickly conversation could become accusation, and accusation would only muddy the waters at this stage.
On a Wednesday night, with a pile of boxes in the garage and the house smelling faintly of lemon from the cleaner Susan had recommended, I sat down at the kitchen table and took out the letter again. I read the words aloud to myself, like a prayer that could be understood by both the living and those who would be left holding the news. I folded it, put it in an envelope, and tucked it into the drawer I used for stamps. I told myself the envelope would be mailed after closing, as planned. It felt like an act of courtesy and a small mercy for them, to receive an explanation rather than a rumor.
Still, before any letter was mailed, life remained thin with possible consequences I could not predict. I would lie awake thinking of the moment someone in the family would pick up a phone and say, "Did you know the house is on the market?" I imagined their voices, the sharpened edges that come when people think they've been trespassed upon. Would they call to beg, to plead, to accuse me of betrayal? I could not know. There were so many small tremors I had to steady myself against. What the neighbors might think, what old friends might say when they noticed the moving boxes, what I might feel when the hardwood floor that had felt like a backbone of my life became, in someone else's hands, a sold advertisement. The truth is, making the choice did not erase the fear of how they would react. The plan did not make me immune to loneliness. What it did was give me a framework to live by. I was responsible for my later years, and I could make choices about them. The house had been a source of identity for decades. Deciding its fate felt like taking a pen to a draft of a life and ending a chapter that no longer fit. One morning, late in the packing, I found a voicemail from Daniel. He sounded short, the way someone sounds when they are trying to hide worry with irritation. "Mom," he said, "I heard something on the block. Are you selling the house?" I let the message sit for a while, as if it needed to mature. I could have returned the call and told him the whole plan, or I could have let the process stay private until the legalities were complete. I chose the latter. The decision to wait was not cruelty. It was a protection of my own peace. I did not want to be on a phone call where guilt and anger would try to wrestle my calm away. Days moved forward. An offer came faster than I expected. It was around 9:10, as Thomas had suggested might happen. I remember the digits as if they were beads on a string. 910. We negotiated the closing date. There were details, appliances to include what would stay, what would go, the old wooden dining table that had a nick in one corner from a screwdriver that Richard used to tune a part of the kitchen cabinet. Each request and counter-request was a small horizon I had to cross. As I packed, I found small treasures I had forgotten. A letter from Richard when we were newly married, with ink that had faded, but sentiment that felt bright. I read it and felt a tenderness that made my throat tighten. I placed it in the shoebox with the 1996 photo. I told myself what I had to, that making this move was not an act of malice. It was an act of survival and reclamation. I would not, as a final act of spite, deny them a seat at a funeral or a chance to remember. But I also would not let them assume my life's purpose was to fund their choices at the cost of my dignity. The house's lights dimmed in the evenings, and sometimes I would stand on the porch and watch neighbors come and go, unaware of the private revolution that was underway. The maple tree kept shedding leaves like a calendar, each one falling gently and then gone. I wondered if they would understand one day. I suspected some would never understand. Some might only feel betrayed. That night, as I closed my laptop and put the last box in the car, I had the sense of standing at the edge of a narrow bridge. On the other side was Asheville, watercolor brushes, and mornings on a balcony. On this side were the faces that had shaped me. I knew there would be consequences, phone calls I might not want to take, letters that might sting. A family meeting called with an urgency that was meant to unnerve. I knew that legal pushback was a possibility. After all, life had taught me that where money is at stake, words get sharp. But for the first time in a long while, my nights weren't spent counting what I had given away. They were spent listing small personal things I wanted to do. I thought of joining a book club and trying a watercolor of sand and light, and of volunteering at the women's shelter where I could be helpful without being depleted. I thought of traveling. Santa Fe had always been somewhere my heart wanted to stand. I imagined shopping for a small plant for the balcony and being the kind of person who plants it and waters it herself. The plan was in motion. The listings were live. Offers had been considered and one accepted. The boxes were packed. The shoebox with the photograph sat in the car. The note lay folded in the drawer. And yet, as I turned off the kitchen light that night, I felt a thread of apprehension still taut inside me. I had acted lawfully, transparently with my professionals, and with my dignity intact. But I knew that action creates reaction. I was prepared for some of it in the sense that I had counsel and accounts and a new address. I was not prepared for the ache of explanation, or the particular sting of being misunderstood by those I loved most. When you have loved people for a lifetime, you learn that relationships are never simple. They contain kindness, and they contain small, sharp disappointments. My family had shown me both.
The choice to sell wasn't about legally tricking anyone or committing fraud.
It was about setting a limit on what I would accept, about refusing to be valued only as a future asset. They had cut me out of the warmth of their attention when the bank had closed. I was taking back my life without breaking the law, executing a plan for my future rather than submitting to a timetable written by someone else. I put the last box in the trunk and closed it with a soft thud that sounded a lot like a decision. I walked back into the house, ran my hand along the banister where my fingers had learned to trace the grain, and looked one more time at the kitchen where I had written the note. The sunlight on the counter made the envelope glow a little. It smelled faintly of dust and lemon and the faint perfume of memories I planned to keep, even as I changed the address where I made new ones. I was aware then of the strange irony that sat like a coin between my palms. They had hoped to inherit me by counting years and withholding care, and in the end I would execute my will not by waiting for death, but by choosing life. I could almost hear their imagined arguments forming in the wings, accusations of betrayal, of acting in haste, but I also had my quiet list of reasons, and for the first time in a long while, they felt adequate. The closing date was set. The goodbyes were arranged in a way that would preserve my dignity. No dramatic confrontations, no social media announcements, just practical steps. I had asked Susan to handle the inquiries, and attorney Patricia to have the paperwork in readiness. I had asked Margaret to drive me to the closing if I wanted someone with me. I had left the note folded in its drawer like a delicate truth, waiting for the right time. If someone asked me then whether I was scared, I wouldn't have lied. Fear and courage often live in the same house. But I also would have said that I had found a small, stubborn joy in the sense of authorship. For decades, I had been the provider, and in that role, I had sometimes lost myself. Now I was authoring the rest of my life. Authoring for me meant deciding where I would live, who would see me, and how I would spend the days I had left. And then, with the listing live and the accepted offer in place, with the move to Asheville nearly arranged, and the shoebox of memories in the trunk, there was a small, sudden silence that felt like the inhale before something else happened. I knew the sale would be noticed. I knew the reaction would be human, messy, and possibly bitter. I knew the legal letters, if they came, would be handled by attorney Patricia. I knew I could be accused of being cold or selfish by people who hadn't walked a week in my shoes. What I didn't know was how it would affect them, my children, the moment the reality landed. Would Daniel call and beg? Would Jennifer demand explanations? Would Michael show up at my door with a suitcase and apologize? Would there be a certified letter whose words would sting?
I had prepared for some of those contingencies with practical measures, but no spreadsheet can account for the particularities of a human heart. So I stood on the porch that evening, box of photographs safe in the trunk of my car, and watched the sun sink behind the maple tree. The light went soft, and the house, for the first time in a while, felt like a place someone else might live in soon. It also felt like mine still, in the way a first edition book belongs to its reader, even when it changes hands. I whispered to the photograph in my bag and felt a small, fierce gratitude for the life that brought me to that porch, and the courage to leave it. The door closed softly behind me as I walked to the car. The quiet was not empty now. It hummed with the pending motion of everything I had set into place. I turned the key in the ignition and thought oddly of watercolor. I thought of the way the paint spreads when you drop it in water and how beautiful it can be to watch colors decide to be together. I was, at once, leaving something and stepping into colors I had not chosen before. There were letters I hadn't opened yet, calls I hadn't returned, and a handful of days before the closing when anything could unfold. The house waited, patient as any inanimate thing, while people prepared responses they had not yet felt. I drove away with the shoebox on the passenger seat and the envelope tucked into its drawer, an explanation waiting for a moment I had decided would be after the sale. The road to Asheville felt like a ribbon of possibility. I felt, finally, the quiet form of relief that comes not from being right or grand, but from doing what you must to protect the life you have left to live. The drive to Asheville felt like a pause between two lifetimes. I kept the shoebox on the passenger seat like a talisman. Every so often I would reach over and touch the cardboard, feeling the ridged edge as if it could steady me. The highway unrolled in a steady gray, and with each mile the weight of the house unspooled a little. I had done the legal work. I had signed and countersigned. The forms were in place. Now I simply had to cross the finish line. Closing morning arrived with the kind of Christmas that makes small things seem possible. Margaret drove me to the title company and sat beside me while I signed the final pages. There were pens on the table, and for a second the room smelled like paper and coffee and newness.
Susan handed me the closing documents with the same professional calm she had brought to the staging. Thomas had flown in for the day and sat with his briefcase like a man who had come to watch a careful plan land. Attorney Patricia, my Patricia, who wears suits like armor, was already there, moving through the room with the efficiency of someone who keeps people's affairs tidy.
When the final signatures were done, the check was cut, and the net figure, the one Thomas and I had held against sleepless nights, looked back at me from the bottom line, roughly $862,000. Numbers on paper can feel unreal until they buy the things that matter. A condo in a town I liked, a modest emergency fund that wouldn't eat into my pleasures, money set aside for travel and care. It felt like a cushion beneath my feet. There was an odd hush in the parking lot afterward. Margaret and I sat for a few minutes with our coffees, neither of us ready to turn the key in the ignition. I felt a small, dizzy happiness that was not loud or triumphant, just an honest, private relief. There was an agreement to mail the letters after the closing. That was the decision we had made together in the quiet of my kitchen. I had left the note folded in its drawer so it would go into the outgoing mail and arrive for them after the sale was final. I wanted clarity, not chaos. It took less time than I feared for the family to find out. My phone did the thing it always does. Ring, ring, and then become a chorus. The first call was not the one I expected. Daniel left a voicemail that was clipped, taut. He sounded hurt, and incandescent with the kind of righteous anger that can make a person sound younger than they are. "You sold the house?" he said. "We need to talk. What is wrong with you?" I let the message sit unread for a day because I needed the quiet to gather myself. When I listened, his breath hitched in the middle, as if he had practiced indignation in the mirror. Jennifer sent a text that began with caps lock and ended with multiple question marks. Michael called twice and then left a voicemail that sounded like someone trying to choose between pleading and accusing. Patricia, Daniel's wife, sent a message that read like a reprimand masked as concern. I listened to all of them once. That was a choice I had made for my own dignity. I heard their anger and their confusion. I heard a little fear that the map they had been reading was being torn up. I saved one message, Daniel's, long enough to feel the heat of it, and then I deleted it. The rest I blocked. Not because I didn't want them to reach me, but because at the moment, I needed to preserve the newfound calm I had bought myself. The rage that carries in a phone line can unravel you in 10 minutes. I had spent 4 years getting to a place where I could answer with truth. I would not let myself be derailed by a chorus that had yet to sit with the facts. A week after closing, a certified letter arrived at my mailbox. It was the legal thing I had been bracing for, the formal document that said they were contesting the sale and my competence to consent. The letter was typed, stamped, and heavy with implication. It accused me, in polite legal terms, of being unduly influenced and of not fully understanding the consequences of the sale. They had hired a lawyer. The language was clinical, but the intent was raw and personal. The house was the core contention. That is when attorney Patricia moved like she always does, without drama, with detail. She wrote back within 48 hours with an answer that looked less like a rebuttal and more like a careful factual map. She sent copies of my signed documents, the disclosures I had made to Thomas, the assessment he had performed, and the email exchanges where I had discussed my desires to move and live somewhere with less upkeep. She included a signed affidavit from me stating my reasons, and she included a short declaration from Thomas that laid out the financials, the $300,000 given over 4 years, the projections, the way the sale preserved my security. She also attached the listing details and the timeline showing I had acted while I was competent and on my own behalf. There was no shouting, there was no courtroom theater. There was simply the law functioning the way it is intended, to look at facts. Within a couple of weeks, the filing from their attorney was withdrawn. I was not granted some grand vindication. I was granted the quiet result of sound paperwork and sensible counsel, and a woman whose job it is to make sure people's choices are recorded and respected. It is important to me to say that clearly. What happened next was specific to my situation. I do not pretend it is a blueprint for everyone. I only know what I did and how the professionals I trusted guided me. Calls continued for a while, friends and distant relatives picking up bits of gossip. Some messages were apologetic, some were sharp. Jennifer left a voicemail that was small and raw, a mixture of curved and a tremulous wish to understand. Michael's voice, when it eventually came through, was quieter. Daniel sent a text that was closer to a demand for reconciliation than to an olive branch. I read the messages and I felt their layers.
Grief, surprise, a sense of loss that we had not named until we lost the shape of things. I did not recycle everything into a narrative of villainy. They had behaved in ways that were hurtful, yes, but they were not monsters. They were also my children, confused, sometimes selfish, sometimes capable of tenderness. There was for me a ritual in how I closed that door. I listened to their angry voicemails once and then deleted them. I blocked numbers that felt abusive. I let a few calls go unanswered because I needed to be able to answer calmly when the time came. I mailed the note to be received after closing as planned. When it arrived, photographs tucked in the envelope, the note folded like a small book, the reactions splintered into predictable pieces. Daniel stormed and then sat. He called and left messages that shifted from fury to a request for explanation. Jennifer emailed a long, vulnerable essay about feeling abandoned. Michael showed up at my door 3 weeks later with a pie, which he left on the stoop and drove away.
There were followed-up conversations, awkward dinners, and the slow, murky work of negotiating a new kind of relationship with them. Some of those conversations were healing. Some were never quite what I hoped. That was messy and real and human. One afternoon, not long after I had settled into the condo, attorney Patricia called. Her voice was brisk, but there was a softness beneath it, like when someone hands you a blanket. "They withdrew," she said. "You can be at peace about the legal front." It felt for a moment like permission to breathe out and mean it. Asheville turned out to be everything Margaret had promised and a little more. The condo was small but suffused with sun, morning light that made the corners of the room look like an hour someone had gilded. The balcony looked out over maples that decided to be particularly showy each fall. I put a small table on the balcony and 2 mismatched chairs, the kind you find at estate sales, and then paint so they look intentional. I planted a rosemary and a geranium. It felt indulgent, in the best way, a small, conscious taking care of myself. The first month was disorienting and full of small delights. I joined a book club whose members met on Thursday afternoons. We argued charitably about characters and then went for pie across the street. I took a watercolor class that began as clumsy splashes and became moments of real wonder, how a wash of blue could become a sky, how a few wet brushstrokes could imply a mountain without bullying it into being. There was a woman in the class named Lucia who had moved from New Mexico and who smelled faintly of sage. She became a quick, fierce friend. There was a retired nurse, Jo, who liked to bring cookies and tell vivid stories about a life that had been very full. I started volunteering at a women's shelter on Mondays. I had avoided that kind of thing before because my time was always parceled out to other people's emergencies. There, my hands felt useful without being depleted. We sorted donations and taught a sewing class. I found pleasure in small, practical kindnesses, fixing a hem, packing a bag of toiletries. It made my days feel like they had a currency other than worry. Travel came next. Santa Fe had been in my bones for decades, a wide, sun-baked place that felt like a different kind of clean. I flew out with a small carry-on and bought myself a turquoise ring on the plaza, the kind of little indulgence that felt like a punctuation mark. You have done this for yourself. The trip was not a blitz of strangers and salacious happiness. It was a string of quiet days, museums, walks on desert trails, conversations with artists who painted the same sky in 200 different ways. I returned home feeling both small and large in some new proportion.
There were practical purchases, too. A new mattress that made my back glad. A small tablet I used to Zoom with book club when snow made travel impossible. A painting I commissioned from Lucia of the balcony tree that shades the condo. Money felt sane and usable and no longer a leash. The hardest parts were the things you can't budget for. The absence of those years when I had been the point person. The way my house had functioned as the gravitational center of certain family rituals. Then this the chaos sometimes. The noise of 3 plates clearing a table, a voice that always left a question unfinished. The memories were not painful merely for being memories. They were just what they were. Familiar, complex, threaded with love. But that thread no longer had to drag me into a life that was not mine. Our phone conversations with the children settled into an odd new rhythm. Daniel called sometimes with updates about his job, and then, tentatively, about his own life. Jennifer texted photos of her garden. Michael came by once with a casserole and stayed for 2 hours. He didn't force apologies, but he made room. None of these developments erased the past. They simply layered over it, as seasons layer a landscape. There were times I still felt the sting of things unsaid. There were times I thought maybe they would never understand my calculus. But there were also emergent things, new rituals in which I was an actor in my own right. At book club, someone said, "It's strange how our second acts are rarely the scripts we expected." We all laughed.
but I felt the truth of it like sunlight on my hands. I had not set out to cast anyone as villain. I had set out to be honest about what I needed. Years are like quiet bricks sometimes. They build unexpectedly. I painted more, I read more, and I learned how to schedule small pleasures the way one schedules appointments. There was a confidence to a life arranged with one's own taste. I planted lemon balm in a sun dish and watched it spread like a tiny, generous plant. I went to a poetry reading one Thursday and sat in the back, letting words settle over me like a shawl. People sometimes ask whether selling the house felt like betrayal. The answer is complicated. Selling the house felt like both leaving a room I loved and stepping into the light I had been postponing. I did not wish to hurt them. I did not wish to make them less of my life. But I also could not stay on a path where my final years were contingent on the goodwill of people who had shown me a pattern of expecting me to give without ceasing. There is a line between generosity and self-erasure. Drawing it felt terrifying and necessary. There were surprising blessings. A neighbor in Asheville, Claire, invited me to a small potluck where everyone brought a dish and something they were making in their life. I brought a lemon tart and told the table, honestly, some of my story. They listened without the complicated history that lives inside family.
Sometimes I was offered a kind of attention that was easy, a borrowed cup of sugar, an offered aisle in the grocery store. Those little courtesies piled up into a life that felt repairable. One afternoon, months after the closing, I received a letter from Jennifer, one of those long, written things that people used to do before texts made everything instantaneous. She wrote in a script that wavered in places. She talked about shame and confusion, about how hard it had been to watch me set a line and stick to it. She wrote about things I hadn't known, pressures at work, marriages that had sagged under debt. Her letter did not fix everything, but it offered the slow promise of conversation. That promise felt like rain on an overwarm day. Sometimes a quiet happens in a life, and you realize it is not the absence of people, but the presence of a new kind of choice. I found myself laughing more deeply, reading more recklessly, deciding to stand in the sun because I could. I learned to select which phone calls to answer and which to let ring. My days were not only safer, they were freer in a particular and practical way. I think now of the phrase in the headline I imagined, "They cut her out of the inheritance. She executed the will." When I first heard Thomas say, "You can execute your will now," it struck me with an odd electric familiarity. People hear "executed the will" and imagine legal machinations or dramatic courtroom scenes. For me, executing my will was quieter and truer. It was making a deliberate, legal, and above-board choice about the future of my home and the shape of my life while I was still here to live it. I did not manipulate, deceive, or hide. I signed documents. I consulted professionals. I acted within the law. The point was to remove the comfortable fiction that my life belonged to others as a future asset. I reclaimed the authority to be present in my final chapters. There were days when the grief for what had been, family dinners, a full house, arrived and sat with me like an old friend. But grief was not the only thing. There was also the small, steady joy of sitting on the balcony at dusk with a cup of tea, the air cooling like a promise. There was the new hum of mornings that belonged to me. And there was a difficult recompense, respect for myself that did not need to be demanded from others. I think now of the photograph from 1996, the one with sauce on Richard's cheek and the kids laughing. I have it on a small shelf in my new place. It is not hidden. It is a memory of a life that taught me how to love and how to shield myself when love was used as a lever. It is also a reminder that motherhood and self-respect are not mutually exclusive. If you have listened this far and something in my voice resonates, maybe you have also felt stretched thin by people you loved. Maybe you have found yourself counting not just money, but the cost to your own days. I do not offer a formula.
I only offer what I know is true for me, that choosing life and dignity sometimes looks like a practical decision that others will misunderstand, and that is a risk you take, not to punish, but to preserve yourself. I could have waited until the day I could no longer choose. Instead, I executed my will while I was alive. I decided the house would not be a reason for someone to wait for my death. I decided to keep living. That, to me, is the most honest way to honor the memory of the life Richard and I built, by living it on my terms, not as a prelude. If Barbara's story moved you, subscribe and share. Someone out there may need this reminder that dignity can be reclaimed.